Okay, hello everyone. My name is Emma. I am from the C.A.T.C.H team, and today I will be presenting to you about mental health, and our goal for this presentation is to increase awareness and erase stigmas. I do want to point out the trigger warning at the bottom of the title, just to point out that we will be having a discussion of mental health issues today. And I know that can be triggering for some people, depending on where you're at in your life at this moment. So if you are needing a break at any point, feel free to step away or just log out and take the time that you need. Next slide. Okay, so to just start us off, here is some information about the team. Again, we are from Argus Community, specifically the C.A.T.C.H team, and C.A.T.C.H stands for Community Action to Combat to combat HIV and HCV. So we provide free HIV and Hep C testing, and it's confidential, completely judgment-free zone. We also go to different locations and provide sexual health education. And next slide. Okay, so I also wanted to start off this presentation with a quote from Demi Lovato. They have been a very big kind of celebrity face to the mental health movement over the years. And this is a great quote. So Demi says, "I wish people could understand that the brain is the most important organ of our body. Just because you can't see mental illness like you could see a broken bone doesn't mean it's not as detrimental or devastating to an individual." Next slide. Okay, so for a little overview for today, we will start off with talking about what mental health is. We'll then go into talking a little bit about the stigma that society brings to mental health, and we'll go over in detail the most common mental health issues and their symptoms, causes, and risk factors. The four we're going to be focusing on today is depression, anxiety, PTSD, and bipolar disorder. We'll also be discussing how your mental health issues can affect your body. So healthy mind equals healthy body. And then we'll also discuss seeking help. Next slide. Okay, so just starting us off again, just kind of think to yourself, how would you define mental health and what is your view on mental health in society? Next slide. So per the World Health Organization, mental health is the ability for an individual to realize their own abilities. They are able to cope with normal stressors in life. They are able to work productively and fruitfully, and they are able to make a contribution to their community. And they also talk about mental health being a state of one's well-being. And there's three different categories that are kind of under that umbrella. And that's emotional, psychological, and social. Emotional is more about being able to recognize your own emotions and how you deal with them. Psychological would be any mental health diagnoses that you have. And social would be your ability to maintain and create long-term relationships. And that would be romantically and platonically. Next slide. Okay, so going into the stigma that surrounds mental health. So the general definition of stigma is a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. So in today's discussion, the stigma is around mental health. We know that in society, a lot of people who are experiencing depression or anxiety may be viewed as lazy, or crazy, and there's a lot of other mental health issues that may come up where people just label those individuals as crazy. So yeah, the stigma that is around mental health. It often causes individuals to have difficulty finding work, being in a steady long-term relationship, being included in social settings, and being able to recover from those mental health issues. Stigma oftentimes causes people to be scared to go and find help, so that's where the recovery aspect comes in. Next slide. Okay, so here we have a video by a woman named Michaela Mulenga. She is located in Australia, and I think that's a pretty cool thing to point out here is that this mental health stigma is not just in our city, it's not just in our country, it's throughout the whole entire world. And so she goes in more in detail about stigma and how it can affect greater populations. You can go ahead and start it, Sean.
Mental illness, a condition which causes serious disorder in a person's behavior or thinking. Stigma, a mark or disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. So for this, I'm going to need each and every one of you to trust me. Everybody close your eyes. Close them. Good. And now, please raise your hand if you suffer or previously have suffered from a mental illness. Now in a moment, I'm going to ask everyone to open their eyes. So if you feel comfortable, please keep your hands raised. Otherwise, please put it down. Now everyone open your eyes and look around. You may put your hands down now, thank you. So before opening your eyes, a number of people did in fact put their hands down, and some didn't raise them at all. The reason being that they felt uncomfortable with people knowing that they had a mental illness. And I'm not at all shaming those who did put their hands down, but this is what the stigma is, and this is what it does to people. It makes them feel like having a mental illness is embarrassing, like it's a personal failure or weakness, that it's being lazy or selfish. Nobody wants to talk about mental illness as it's a taboo in this day and age, but when we bring up this controversial topic, everyone has so many different opinions about it. And opinions based on myths cause misconceptions and the stigma around it, which is why I unquestionably feel the need to talk about this. You know, society is always telling us that mental illness isn't real or it's imaginary, and that is where the stigma begins. The stigma cycle, as some like to call it, begins with the negative perception of mental illness. You see, I go to school with 950-ish students, and about 190 of those students have a mental illness. Now, half of those students will get treatment and see a psychologist or therapist, but the other half have been silenced by the disgrace that is associated with these illnesses. It has made them believe that they are weak and that their illness is just an excuse. We get this negative perception from how mental illness is portrayed in real life and in the media, but what we see and hear isn't always true. So let's go through some. Depression. When that word comes up, what do you think of? Because I know that when I use the word depressed, which is something that myself and all of us need to stop doing because it adds to the stigma, but when I use that word, I use it as an over-exaggeration for being sad. Like, after my favorite characters died in a TV show, it would always follow with, wow, I'm actually so depressed right now. But what I learned through some interviews that I took with people that actually had depression was that it's much more than being a bit upset. Depression is darkness. It's fear. It's worthlessness. It's pain. and it's deep thoughts of death or suicide. So it's not just an adjective that we can use whenever we wish. You know, I used to think, and some people still think, that this is what all depression looks like. And yeah, some people with depression can look like this at times, but majority of the time, this is what depression actually looks like. Now, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. Social anxiety. Social anxiety isn't hating small talk or resenting meeting new people. Social anxiety is feeling like you're constantly being judged or feeling uncomfortable in public. It's avoiding people and situations like ordering food and having to recite the order in your head in case you've forgotten it, or making a phone call and basically having to script out what you're going to say. People living with this disorder have trouble doing so many everyday things, which makes life extremely hard for them. Now, anxiety disorder is non-stop worrying and anxiousness. You know, panic attacks don't always have to be hyperventilating and rocking back and forth, but they can be hypersensitivity, pacing, trembling, or silence. And in case you've never had a panic attack and you're still a little bit lost, do you know that sudden burst of fear that you get when you miss a step and almost die falling down the stairs? That's basically what a panic attack feels like. Now, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating all fall under the category of eating disorders. Now, eating disorders aren't lifestyle choices, nor are they cries for attention. And they can occur in many ways, but one of the biggest nowadays is low self-esteem and body image. Now, social media is one of the biggest causes of low self-esteem because it's just a whole never-ending cycle of this is what you're expected to look like, and this is what everyone else is doing, so you need to do this too. And it's really exhausting. You know, social media has such a dangerous impact on our mental health because we all have that mindset that we need to purchase whatever appetite suppressant tea or candy that Kim or Khloe Kardashian are promoting to get that slim, thick body figure that everybody wants and is expected to look like. So a guy or girl with anorexia fears being overweight. And someone with bulimia binge eats and avoids gaining weight at all costs. And binge eaters feel loss of control when eating. So no, they can't just eat a sandwich or a hamburger to gain weight automatically, nor can they just go to a gym to lose all that weight, because it's just not that simple, and eating disorders don't work like that. They can happen in many ways and occur at any time, but majority of the time, it starts when someone logs into the thing in life that they can't live without: social media. Now, still following the stigma cycle, the next step is the fear of discrimination, which we have touched on briefly from that exercise that we did at the start. Because in the past, society has shamed those who have had the courage to speak out about their mental illness, it has caused those deeply suffering to have no choice but to keep quiet. You know, society perceives mental health disorders as something that's all in someone's head and isn't real, but to me, that's just like going up to someone who's asthmatic and saying that their disease isn't real and it's all in their lungs. Now, following the negative perception and the fear of discrimination, the next step in the stigma cycle is the avoidance of help and resources. And to be honest, if I was surrounded by friends or family that constantly made jokes or negative comments against mental illness, chances are high that I'd probably avoid opening up to anyone else. The stigma continues to make life a lot harder for victims of mental illness because we all put an image in everyone's mind that mental illness is a joke and that those with it are insane and it isn't real. And yeah, you can't see mental health disorders like you can with physical illnesses, but that doesn't mean that it's not there or isn't as real. And to those who still think like that, mental illnesses that are left untreated can have negative consequences on that person and the people surrounding them, like self-medicating with illegal drugs leading to substance abuse and worsening mental health problems. So how are we going to overcome the stigma and end the stigma cycle before it begins? Well, first, let's end the negative perception. And let's stop referring to people with mental illness as crazy and call out anyone around us who does. Then we can start educating people and start opening up mental illness to discussion in workplaces and classrooms. You know, Lady Gaga says that we gotta take care of each other. So if you see someone who's hurting, don't look away. And if you're hurting, even if it might be hard, try to find that bravery within yourself to dive deep and go tell somebody. Now, if someone around you is trying to open up to you about what they're going through, please listen. Don't minimize what they're trying to tell you, and be patient, because imagine how hard it is for them and what they're going through. A psychologist called Noam Spencer says that mental health is not a destination, but a process. It's about how you drive, not where you're going. Now, I know we can't solve this problem immediately because stigmas just don't work like that. But I really do have faith in this society that made life suck for people with mental illness to make it suck a lot less. Let's continue to call others out who are feeding the stigma cycle, and let's start acknowledging that mental health is just as important as physical health. And how about we all take a minute each day to be grateful for everything in life that isn't completely trash right now? Let's use our two hands to reach out a hand to someone, to anyone who needs support, and join together to overcome the stigma around mental illness. Thank you for listening.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, so that was a video again by Michaela Mulenga, and I think she just does a really great job at just explaining the stigma and how it can affect people who are experiencing mental illness. Next slide. Okay, so now we'll jump into going into more detail about the most common mental health issues. We'll start off with depression, go into anxiety, and then post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, and then bipolar disorder. Next slide. Okay, so starting off with depression, we have a quote from Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And he says that I found that with depression, one of the most important things you could realize is that you're not alone. Next slide. So what is depression? Depression is defined as persistent, uncontrollable sadness and also experiencing a lack of interest and pleasure in normally enjoyable activities and day-to-day life tasks. So it's kind of this feeling of you just feel really sad. Sometimes you're not sure why. It can be triggered by a specific event, a major loss in your family, or some other event that kind of triggered the sadness. But then the depression comes in when you're unable to kind of get out of that funk, and it kind of gets to a point where you're not totally sure why you're feeling so sad. And there are a few different types of depression. I just picked a few that are the most common. Major depression is defined as feeling depressed for at least 2 weeks. So if you have been feeling depressed for 2 weeks or more, that can be defined as major depression. Another type is seasonal affective disorder, and that also known as SAD, which is kind of a funny pun, I would say. So that comes in more seasonally, as it says in the title. So think of in the winter time, you're feeling more down. It often comes with like kind of cold temperatures, and in general, I know many people have made comments about kind of having seasonal affect disorder. And I think it's a lot more common than people may think. There's also substance-induced depression, and that is caused by people who have substance use issues. It can spiral into whatever substance is being used can spiral into a depression, and also individuals can experience depression while they're going through withdrawal. Next slide. So here is a fact that is about depression from the National Institute of Mental Health. And so based on data from 2017, about 1 in 10 people have experienced depression in their lifetime. So that feels very common for me. If you think about 10 people that you know, at least one of them has experienced depression or will experience depression in their lifetime. Next slide. So some symptoms and causes of depression. For symptoms, it can be tearfulness and a feeling of hopelessness. You can have issues controlling your emotions, so that can include angry outbursts, irritability, or frustration. Like I mentioned before, a loss of interest and in day-to-day activities. You can have sleep disturbance issues, experience low self-esteem, self-blame, and issues with concentration and remembering things as well. Some causes of depression are inherited traits. So it can kind of just be in your DNA. If you have a history of mental health issues in your family, depression can be more common for you. There's also, depression can come along with hormone level changes as well. And your hormone levels can change during stress, pregnancy, thyroid issues, just for a few examples. And also just the way your brain chemistry is laid out as well, the way your neurotransmitters communicate with each other. Everyone's different in the way their brain is wired, to say. And so a lot of it just comes with the way your brain works. Next slide. Some risk factors for depression. So those who have these risk factors may be more susceptible to experiencing depression. Like I mentioned before, the DNA and the way your brain is wired, it kind of comes into line with the personality traits. Those who tend to be have a more pessimistic view of the world and of reality are more susceptible to experiencing depression. If an individual experiences a traumatic or stressful event, as I mentioned before, they are more susceptible for depression. This also includes secondary trauma. And secondary trauma is when, for most of the time, it comes up in workplace situations, or if you have someone who is close to you going through a traumatic situation. Hearing about other people's trauma can then impact your own mental health. Again, like I mentioned before, a history of depression in the family. If you have other mental health issues, anything else that's diagnosed, depression is a very common comorbidity with other mental health issues. And like I mentioned before, substance use and also serious chronic illness. That can be things like fibromyalgia or cancer. Those diagnoses can also come with depression, as clients often kind of feel like there is an end coming for them. Their whole life has changed, and so depression can be triggered from that experience as well. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to go into anxiety, and we have a quote from Brandon Marshall, and Brandon says that we need to accept that mental illness is a disease. And like any other disease, it needs stronger research, early screening, and treatment, especially for young people. Next slide. Okay, so anxiety can kind of be split up into two categories. There is a normal anxiety that everyone experiences. It's the kind of stress that you feel when you're running late to an appointment, something you feel before a job interview. The normal anxiety is defined as anxiety that is felt with tied to one specific situation. Like I mentioned before, you're running late for something or you have a job interview. When it becomes disordered, that is when it's intense, persistent, and uncontrollable. Similar to when I was talking about depression earlier, that uncontrollable sadness. So people who have an anxiety disorder also have a fear of everyday situations. They're constantly worried that something is going to happen. And when someone has repeated episodes of these thoughts, it can turn into a panic attack. And Michaela, the speaker in the video that we watched, kind of went into panic attacks as well. There are a few different types of anxiety, and the three that I chose to focus on today are general, social, and obsessive compulsive disorder. For general, that is essentially just what I was explaining previously in this slide. Social anxiety is more around social settings and interacting with others. So if you are talking to someone who comes off extremely introverted, that might just be their social anxiety. They might not actually be an introverted person. Individuals who suffer from social anxiety aren't necessarily sure how to interact with new people, and they might feel more comfortable around those that they are closer to. Obsessive compulsive disorder, also known as OCD, that is a type of anxiety where you become very obsessed on things like the order or when you do something, and you're unable to feel normal without doing so. Next slide. So for another fact, here is one about anxiety, and it's from the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They say that about 1 in 5 people have an anxiety disorder. So that is very common. It is more common than depression. But also I do want to note that a lot of mental health data is probably, the numbers might be higher because of the stigma. A lot of people may lie on reports where they are giving these numbers or not feel comfortable sharing. But 1 in 5 is a lot higher than 1 in 10. Next slide. So some symptoms and causes of anxiety. Symptoms include nervousness, restlessness, or feeling tense. You constantly have this sense of impending danger, but you're not sure where that it's coming from. You're experiencing panic attacks. You feel very weak and tired and sometimes unmotivated as well. You have difficulty concentrating, and you are unable to control the worrying. The causes of anxiety are similar to depression as well, with the inherited traits and traumatic events, and also the medical illness. The anxiety is a little bit different in that those who, it's specific, not specifically, but they're more common in those who have asthma or respiratory issues, heart disease, or thyroid issues. And then also withdrawal is another symptom, or can also cause anxiety like depression as well. But with the medical illnesses and anxiety, they're constantly worried that maybe their condition will get worse, or maybe they have another medical illness that they think might not be diagnosed yet, and also feeling anxious about their recovery status. Next slide. So some risk factors for anxiety, like I mentioned before, trauma and illness. Accumulated stress can also cause an anxiety disorder. So if you have multiple episodes of the normal anxiety that I mentioned earlier, you can kind of, you know why you're anxious, you know it's because you're going to be late, or you're meeting someone new. If you have these kind of normal anxiety things over time, that can accumulate and kind of send you down a spiral. If you're constantly feeling stressed all the time, your body can kind of get in this state where that's the normal setting, you could say, for a little bit. And then the history of anxiety in family, other mental health issues as well. Anxiety is oftentimes comorbid with other mental health issues. Your temperament and view on the world, so pessimism versus optimism as well, like I mentioned before, and substance use. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to be going into post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. And we have a quote from Lady Gaga, and she says, "We can no longer afford to be silenced by stigma or stymied by misguided ideas that portray these conditions as a matter of weakness or moral failing." Next slide. So PTSD, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder, is defined as having flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, uncontrollable thoughts about a traumatic event. And it can be tied to a specific traumatic event, but an individual can also experience PTSD due to trauma over a long period of time. So it can be small situations. For example, the way your parents parented you, if they ever did something that might have not seemed super intense or bad in the moment, but was repetitive throughout your childhood, that can cause trauma as well. And going back to the specific traumatic event, that can be experiencing or witnessing the event, which is where that secondary trauma comes in again. Next slide. So here's a fact about PTSD from the Sidran Institute. And so they say that about 1 in 13 people will develop PTSD in their lifetime. So 7 out of 10 adults will experience general trauma in their lifetime. That 70% does not mean that they will develop PTSD. It's just saying that 7 out of 10 adults experience trauma. Now, 2 out of 10 of that 70% will develop PTSD. And that's where, and then it circles back to stating that the 1 out of 13 people will develop PTSD in their lifetime. So PTSD is not necessarily as common as anxiety and depression, but again, there, like I mentioned before, is a lot of stigma against mental health, which can definitely affect these numbers. But that being said, PTSD is generally not as common as depression and anxiety. Next slide. So some symptoms and causes. Like I mentioned before, the individual will experience flashbacks, intrusive, recurrent, uncontrollable memories, emotional distress and physical reactions to reminders of the event or wherever the trauma came from. And sometimes also these reactions, the person may not even realize that it's connected to whatever trauma if they don't realize that they have PTSD. It can be if there is a person, who has this intense anger outbreak. It may have been caused by, they were triggered by a memory that either they are aware of or they're not. Your brain can often hide memories from you, but your body will still react. Another symptom is negative changes in thinking. Also can be depression as well. Some causes, like I mentioned before, experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event and stressful experiences over time. I think it's really important to note that PTSD can develop from multiple stressful experiences over time that may not have felt that traumatic in the moment, but they do cause trauma over time. And then also brain chemical and hormone response to stress. So like I mentioned before, everyone's brains are wired differently, and just the way your neurotransmitters react and interact with each other can determine how your body processes that trauma and causing or not causing PTSD. Next slide. Okay, going into the risk factors. Already mentioned before is the intense, long-lasting trauma over a lifetime. If you have experienced trauma as a young child, having exposure to traumatic events at work, secondary trauma, as I defined earlier, not having access to a good support system. So oftentimes with trauma, you need to be able to process that trauma, or else it just kind of sticks in your brain. And so that's where the good support system comes in. And as I mentioned with the other mental health issues, having a history of that in your family can cause you to be more susceptible to PTSD. Next slide. So our last mental health issue we will be talking about today is bipolar disorder. And there are two types, bipolar disorder type 1 and type 2. And here we have a quote from Michelle Obama, and she says that asking for help is always a sign of strength. Next slide. So bipolar disorder is generally defined as having extreme mood swings that include emotional highs, also known as mania, and emotional lows, also known as depression. And the two types of bipolar disorder, for bipolar 1, it is a manic episode followed by a depressive episode. So you have this really emotional high where you're feeling invincible. You have that for a little bit, and then the next day or even a few minutes later, you tank kind of into this very low depressive episode. And those manic and depressive episodes ebb and flow. They kind of come in and out in phases. It can happen multiple times a year. It can happen once a year. And then for bipolar 2, it's just major depressive episodes, no mania. And so the key difference between bipolar and just general major depressive is that it is kind of coming and going consistently. A lot of people will have one major depressive episode, and then years will go by and maybe they're feeling depressed again. That wouldn't be bipolar. Bipolar would be a little bit more frequently. Next slide. So about 3 out of 100 people have a type of bipolar disorder, and that is from the National Advisory Mental Health Council. So it's not super common. It's not as common as anxiety, depression, and even PTSD. But the good news is that there is a very high recovery rate for those receiving treatment. So there's an 80% recovery rate. And the biggest thing with bipolar is that it is a true brain chemical imbalance. If you have bipolar, and go on medication, from this fact, there is an 80% recovery rate that you will be able to completely balance out those chemicals that are causing these episodes in your brain, and you will be able to feel more stable. Next slide. So some symptoms and causes of bipolar disorder. For the symptoms that come with mania or those emotional highs, that can be feeling abnormally upbeat, jumpy, an increase in energy, and others around you will notice it as well. There's a sense of euphoria. You may have decreased sleep because you have this increase in energy, you'll probably sleep less. Very talkative, racing thoughts, and poor decision making. The poor decision making could be from spending a lot of money to hanging around people who may not be very good for you. Depressive symptoms include feelings of depression, hopelessness, worthlessness, similar to what I was stating before. You can have a change in appetite, sleeping issues, a loss of energy. And so bipolar disorder is mainly caused by genetics. It is the way your brain is wired, and it is a true chemical imbalance, like I mentioned before. And yeah, so it is based on your genetics. So it comes through your family, comes through generations. And yeah, so we can go on to the next slide. So some risk factors. So like I mentioned, having an immediate relative, parent, or sibling with bipolar disorder. And it is important to note that bipolar disorder, like other mental health issues, is fairly underdiagnosed. So some people may not be aware that they have a family member who has bipolar disorder or who had bipolar disorder. So someone who may not be with us anymore, higher up in the family line, maybe a grandparent or great grandparent. And also mental health is an up and coming, fairly new topic that we are discussing in our society. So it just because maybe you maybe someone is saying how they know they don't have bipolar in their family, I believe that it could always be a possibility to have it in your genes. Now, there are triggers for bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder often manifests itself in the more young adult age, I believe it's between 18 and 25-ish. And at that point, when you're kind of in that age range, is when your bipolar disorder can be triggered and kind of start. So if you experience any periods of high stress caused by a traumatic event, or not even a traumatic event, just experiencing more high stress than you're used to, or substance use, that can trigger the start of bipolar disorder. Next slide. So now we're going to jump into how the mind and body are connected. And we have a quote from Michael Phelps. After years of just shoving every negative, bad feeling down to the point where I just didn't even feel it anymore, that sent me down a spiral staircase really quick, and I found myself in a spot where I didn't want to be alive anymore. Next slide. So your mental health issues can result in physical manifestations. When a lot of these mental health issues we discussed have a correlation to stress. So, and when your body experiences stress, your hormone levels change. And that's kind of your fight or flight instinct. And so your adrenaline and cortisol levels will increase. And the fight or flight reaction is something that humans have always had with them, comes back from our hunter-gatherer phases, when we kind of either literally had to fight or run, pretty much. And it's still with us in our bodies. So once the adrenaline and cortisol, you experience an increased heart rate, your digestive system does not work as well, and your immune system does not work as well. And your heart rate increases because it's your body focusing all your energy to your muscles. So you can either fight or run, pretty much. The digestive system and immune system weaken because in that period of time, that is the least of your body's worries. So that your body is going to take the energy and processes that it uses to upkeep those systems and put it all to just kind of get me out of this situation right now. And due to this and due to stress and other hormones involved, you may experience headaches, muscle tension, digestive or gastrointestinal issues, sleep issues, and a feeling kind of brain fog. And going back to the digestive and gastrointestinal issues, there is a hormone that is located in your gut called oxytocin. And oxytocin is released when you experience stress or anxiety. And that basically blocks your digestive system from working super well. So for example, if you are going in for a job interview, you may feel bloated or kind of crampy, and that oxytocin is why. And next slide. Okay, so our last topic of discussion for today is seeking help. And we have a comment from Adele, and she says that she had really bad postpartum depression after she had her son. It frightened her, and she didn't want to talk to anyone about it. She was very reluctant and found out that 4 of her friends felt the same way she did, but everyone was too embarrassed to talk about it. So that goes immediately with our topic at hand. That is the stigma. That is, and I wanted to add this quote at the end just because it is a great example of how stigma around mental health does not do great service to individuals. Next slide. Okay, so improving your mental health. If you're able to, it's a very good idea to get connected with a therapist and doctor. Oftentimes your primary care physician can give you a referral to a therapist. So if you are feeling anything similar to what I discussed today, or maybe you have a concern about something else, it is always wise to go to your primary care physician, and they can set you up with a referral. It is also very nice and therapeutic to have vulnerable conversations with someone you trust. It is very hard on the body to kind of keep all your worries and stresses inside and bottled up. It always feels better and kind of a relief to be able to even just vent. Maybe you don't need advice from someone else, but you just want to vent and get it out. It is also very important to take care of your body. As we know, your mental health can manifest physically, so it's important to try and get as best sleep as you can, eat well, and try and incorporate some daily activity or exercise. And if you're not feeling up for any type of exercise, try an activity that just makes you happy. It can be arts and crafts or reading a book or even watching sports. Whatever makes you happy, that's the most important thing. And also connecting with others. Being vulnerable if you feel comfortable doing so. Oftentimes with those conversations, you can discover similarities you have with others, and that can also be a very comforting conversation to have. And lastly, like I mentioned before, do something that brings you joy. Okay, next slide. It is also important, if you are able to support others. That being said, everyone should be able to take into account their own well-being. And if you are in a place where you feel like you cannot support someone else, it is okay to say that you can't. But if you are able to, it is always good to check in with the people who are close to you. Obviously, make sure you're in a safe space where the other person feels safe, and utilize active, non-judgmental listening. It is best to not kind of throw solutions at them if they are complaining. Always just kind of listen, let them vent to you, and ask them what they need, what will make them feel better. And here are some questions to open the conversation, because I know that, especially with mental health stigma, it can be very awkward, nerve-wracking to kind of try and have these conversations with people who are close to you. So some examples could be, you haven't seen yourself recently, what's going on? Or we haven't talked in a while, how are you doing? Or I know blank just happened, so I wanted to check in with you. How are you feeling? And with opening types of conversations like these, it is also important to recognize that the other person may not want to have these types of conversations. So try not to push too much unless they are very comfortable with you. You know that relationship. And some people might just not be ready to talk. And next slide. So lastly, I have listed some hotlines and helplines that are available to you if you are needing any immediate assistance. We have the NYC Well National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the SAMHSA Treatment Referral Helpline, and the National Eating Disorders Helpline. I put a separate one for eating disorders. I know it was not talked about today, but with eating disorders, it often helps the individual if they are talking with someone who has more direct, specific experience around eating disorders. So yeah, and always, if the immediate situation you are experiencing and are feeling the need to call one of these numbers, if it is potentially life-threatening to you or someone else, do not call these numbers. Call 911 or go to your nearest emergency room. And next slide. And that is all for today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And again, my name is Emma Hughes, and thank you for your time.